There are many of us who believe, there are many of us who don't believe, and then there's a large portion who are just undecided. And I'm talking about what happens to us when we're gone. One of the greatest mysteries on planet Earth, and one which will never ever be solved. How can it be? This particular story is something that I have been very interested in from a young age. Reincarnation. And I do believe, I have read so many stories and seen so many documentaries, and that is my personal opinion, that I do believe in reincarnation. The following story is just one of thousands, and of course it's up to you to make up your own mind. When little James Leiniger was just 2 years old, he started showing signs of strange, odd and frightening behaviour. It took his parents several years to find the reason for this, and when they did, they were shocked beyond belief. The only plausible explanation for their son's strange behaviour was that he was the reincarnation of a fighter pilot who died as a young man at the end of World War II. This is the story of James Leiniger.
Plane on fire. Little man can't get out. These were the words which James screamed out in bed almost every night when he was sleeping. After many nights of hearing their son shouting these and other words out in his sleep, his parents became seriously alarmed, and thinking back on a recent trip to the World War II museum that they had taken James to, they were regretting taking him there, obviously thinking that these nightmares came from that visit. Although there was a huge showroom full of World War II fighter planes and memorabilia, there were no scenes of violence nor any images of disaster which could upset James and cause these nightmare occurrences. But since the visit to the War Museum, young James developed a serious interest in warplanes, an obsession almost. His night terrors became more intense, and he often awoke screaming the words, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out."
They decided to take their son to their family doctor, who was extremely puzzled by everything he heard from the parents. Nightmares and night terrors are common for children, but usually from about the age of 4. The doctor advised the parents not to be afraid and to try and comfort their son when the nightmares occurred, and even try to see if James could describe pictures, places, or words he saw in these nightmares. There was little else he could do. James's behaviour was of a normal, happy child during the day, but night time came and the terrors began for James. This only lasted a short while until, alarmingly, James also suffered with these events during the day. His mother had taken him to a toy store and bought him a model airplane, and when they returned home, his mother pointed at the plane and said to James that there looks to be a bomb under the pilot's cabin. "That's not a bomb," said James without hesitation. "That's a drop tank." And indeed, yes it was, although his mother had no idea how her son would know this, especially at the age of 2, as she didn't know herself that this was what it was. They took James on a trip, and their son amazed them with his professional knowledge and detailed explanations of the planes on the airfield. His parents were becoming more and more worried as to where James was getting all this factual information on warplanes at the age of 2, never having been shown anything to do with planes, especially warplanes, ever.
One night, James had a particularly bad nightmare. It took a long time for his parents to calm him down. More vivid nightmares of warplanes. Following the doctor's advice, his mother asked,
"James, who is the man who can't get out of the burning plane?"
James replied, "Me."
His mother then asked, "What happened to your plane?" And his response stunned her. James said, "It fell. It was hit." His father was in total disbelief at this stage, but kept trying to get as much information from his son as he could while it was still fresh in his mind. His father asked, "Who hit the plane?" And James replied, "The Japanese."
Afterwards, James gave a very detailed description and drawing of Japanese fighter planes from World War II. Confused and wide-eyed, his parents saw that their son had signed his drawings as James III. Much later, after doing some research, they came across a list of pilots who had died in World War II. It shocked them when they saw the name of James Huston Jr., James II. James's grandmother was the first who had the courage to voice her opinion on what was happening. She suggested that maybe the Linear family is dealing with a case of reincarnation. The parents were opposed to this line of thought, more so the father, who became angry at the idea. As a Christian and a rational thinker who worked as a director of human resources at an oil company, he did not want to entertain the thought of something that in his mind was ridiculous. Instead, he continued to try and come up with a reasonable and rational explanation.
In order to do this, he had to ask his son many questions to try and get to the bottom. He asked, "Do you remember the type of plane that the little man flew?" And clear as day, James replied,
"Of course, sir."
Without hesitation. "Where did it take off from?" asked his father. James replied, "A ship called the Natoma." His father started researching the internet and soon found out that an American aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay was used to transport Corsair planes during the war. Intrigued by the coincidence of those two details, he continued to have conversations with his son. Under the guise of a historian writing a book, he went to a meeting of the Natoma Bay veterans. It turned out that every detail his son described were all true. These included the names of technical flight elements, nicknames of combat aircraft, and the location of their last battle in 1945, which the boy recognised in a picture. At that point, his mother was also convinced that the soul of the slain fighter pilot chose their son to return to this world. James's father, however, continued to fight against this superstition. He was intent on trying to catch his son in a mistake in order to prove that the whole story of a fighter pilot was the product of his son's imagination and just amazing coincidences. He asked his son, "Do you know if the man from the plane had any friends?" His son responded immediately with, "Yes, he had a friend named Jack Larson." His father was convinced that the mystery would be cleared up as soon as he could find that there was no such friend called Jack Larson. But that was not the case. Not only did Jack Larson exist and was a fighter pilot during World War II, but he was still alive. James's dad wasted no time in locating the veteran and arranging a meeting. He took to Jack a list of all his son's claims, names, places, events, etc. Jack Larson confirmed each and every one of them in the same detail as his son described them all. He kept on researching and questioning his son, and in one of his son's drawings he found a picture of a burning plane, which no longer surprised him, but what did take him aback was the signature his son had written on the drawing. It read, "To Dad, from James the Third." Why the third? The father asked himself. There were no James seniors or juniors in the family. It was just his son, James. But James Huston was a fighter pilot whose plane went down during combat in 1945.
James's mother turned to a psychotherapist named Carol Bowman, who is the author of a book on the manifestation of reincarnation in the behavior of children. She has investigated dozens of children who have suffered painful memories of past lives. She told them that their son was not unique and that such vivid manifestations of reincarnation usually occur in the instances of violent deaths. Her take on the situation was that the soul was so saturated with past trauma that it couldn't rid itself of even as it entered the other world. This explanation no longer seemed strange to the boy's parents. The psychotherapist advised them to try and speak directly with the pilot when their son was having his nightmares, as the pilot was still living within the boy. She also suggested they ask James to recall his nightmares as actual memories, not dreams.
As time went on, the parents did exactly what was requested, and over time, James's nightmares really did become less severe and less frightening. One day, an incredible piece of the puzzle was found. On a list of pilots who were hit on March 3rd, 1945, was the name James Huston Jr. But in parenthesis it said James 2. If all of this was true, it made sense that little James thought of himself as James the Third. In 2004, when James was 6, his story was featured on the pages of major newspapers and garnered a huge audience on primetime ABC. One of the most fascinating scenes was the family's visit to Anne Barron, the sister of the late James Huston Jr. With difficulty in finding the right words and with tears in her eyes, she confirmed that the boy had told her a lot of things that were known only to her and her brother, who had passed away a long time ago. Anne questioned how it is possible not to believe in other worlds and reincarnation after a story such as this. Members of the Skeptic Society, who actively fight against mysticism and the occult, took it upon themselves to refute the story of James Leninger. They said that Bruce and Andrea Leninger more or less consciously created a family saga in order to rid themselves of feelings of guilt associated with their son's nightmares, which was brought on by the visit to the military museum, also to attract attention to themselves. While there will always be skeptics and there will always be believers, there are literally thousands of similar cases like this worldwide. It is up to the individual to have their own beliefs. Today, James is now grown up and leads a normal life and has had no further nightmares.